There comes a moment after the brilliance of spiritual awakening when the light that once dazzled you seems to dim, when the fire that once burned with purpose suddenly flickers low. You wonder why the very transformation that opened your eyes to truth has left you feeling tired, unmotivated, almost detached from the ambitions and desires that once drove you. Carl Jung understood this paradox well, for he spoke often about the collapse of the old self and the slow, sometimes painful, birth of the new. Awakening strips away illusions, and with those illusions go many of the motivations that once stirred your ego. The achievements, the possessions, the approval of others suddenly, they no longer hold the same weight. You find yourself standing in a vast inner landscape where the old maps no longer guide you, and the new direction has not yet appeared. In this lecture we will explore why this emptiness arises, why it is not a failure but a passage, and how within it lies the hidden work of the soul, the quiet rebuilding of motivation rooted not in ego, but in authenticity and deeper meaning. The collapse of ego-driven desires after awakening is one of the most bewildering and disorienting experiences a person can go through. Before spiritual awakening, life feels like a constant pursuit, an endless striving toward goals, ambitions, and achievements that give a sense of identity and purpose. The ego, with its hunger for recognition, success, and control, fuels this pursuit. It tells you that you must become more, acquire more, and prove more in order to be valuable and fulfilled. And so, the drive to achieve, to compete, to climb higher is powerful. But after awakening, something shifts so profoundly within that those same goals and desires lose their luster. What once seemed urgent now feels trivial. What once gave meaning now feels hollow. The collapse of ego-driven desires leaves a person standing in a strange silence where the usual motivations no longer work, and this can feel like both liberation and loss. Carl Jung spoke often about the nature of the ego and its role in human development. He understood that the ego is not inherently evil or unnecessary. It is a vital part of our structure, helping us navigate the external world and form a sense of identity. But he also emphasized that the ego is not the whole of who we are, and that spiritual development involves transcending the dominance of the ego to connect with deeper layers of the psyche, including the self-awakening. In Jungian terms, is often the recognition that the ego's perspective is limited, that it is but one piece of a vast and intricate whole. When this recognition dawns, the desires and ambitions born of the ego lose their hypnotic hold. Suddenly, the things that once felt worth sacrificing everything for, a promotion, social validation, financial success, no longer have the same compelling force. This collapse is unsettling because, for so long, ego-driven desires served as the engine of life. They got you out of bed in the morning, pushed you to overcome obstacles, and gave you a sense of direction. Without them, many feel adrift. It is like a runner who has trained for years toward a finish line, only to discover that the race itself no longer matters. The runner is left with stamina, discipline, and ability, but without a goal that feels worth pursuing. This emptiness can feel like a void, a loss of identity, and even a kind of death. And in truth, it is the death of the ego as the central ruler of one's life. Jung described this as part of the individuation process, where the narrow, ego-centered identity gives way to a larger, more integrated self. Why does this collapse happen so suddenly after awakening? It happens because awakening shines a light on the illusions the ego feeds upon. Much of what drives us in ordinary life is rooted in fear, the fear of inadequacy, of being unseen, of not mattering. To quiet that fear, the ego seeks accomplishments, possessions, and approval. It creates the illusion that by acquiring these things, we will finally be whole. Awakening exposes that illusion for what it is. It reveals that no external validation, no accumulation of success, no amount of status can fill the inner void. The wholeness we seek cannot be gained through ego-driven striving. It already exists within, waiting to be realized. Once you see this truth, the old desires collapse naturally, because you can no longer believe in their promise. This collapse can feel frightening, even paralyzing, because it strips away the scaffolding of identity. Imagine a house that has been built on shaky foundations, with walls propped up by external achievements. Awakening demolishes those props, and the house begins to crumble. At first it feels like you have lost everything. The collapse leaves you in ruins, uncertain of how to rebuild. But from Jung's perspective, this collapse is necessary. Only by letting the false structures fall can you build a life rooted in authenticity, in alignment with the deeper self. The motivation that emerges after awakening is not gone forever, it is transformed. Instead of being fueled by fear and ego, it becomes rooted in meaning, creativity, love, and purpose that arise from the soul. One of the most difficult aspects of this collapse is that it often creates conflict with the external world. Society is structured around ego-driven desires. Success is measured by wealth, power, appearance, and recognition. When you awaken and no longer care about these measures, you may feel alienated. Colleagues, friends, or family may not understand why you no longer strive for the same goals. Why promotions, awards, or social approval no longer excite you. They may interpret your detachment as laziness, apathy, or failure, when in truth, it is a sign of deeper transformation. Jung himself noted that individuation often sets people apart from the collective because they are no longer bound by the same unconscious drives that govern the majority. This separation can feel lonely, but it is a vital step in becoming who you truly are. The collapse of ego desires is also accompanied by a shift in the experience of time. Before awakening, the future looms large. The ego constantly chases a better tomorrow, pushing you to sacrifice the present for some imagined reward. After awakening, that illusion collapses, and the future loses its grip. You become more aware of the present moment, of the richness of being rather than doing. But this shift can feel uncomfortable at first. Without the constant pull of future goals, life may seem empty, stagnant, or without direction. The truth, however, is that this is the beginning of a new way of living, one rooted in presence rather than striving. It takes time to adjust, and the transition often involves mourning the loss of the old self before embracing the new. Jung often described this process as a descent into the unconscious, a journey into the depths where the ego cannot dominate. In this descent, one confronts the shadow, the anima or animus, and ultimately the self. The collapse of ego desires is the gateway into this descent, because it forces you to stop looking outward for meaning and begin looking inward. Of motivation is not a failure, it is an invitation to turn away from the false promises of the ego and toward the deeper truth of the soul. In this sense, the collapse is a gift, even though it feels like a loss. It clears the ground so that something more enduring can take root. An important aspect of understanding this collapse is recognizing that it is not depression, though it may resemble it. Depression often involves a sense of hopelessness, despair, and disconnection from life itself. The collapse after awakening, by contrast, is a stripping away of illusions. It may feel heavy, confusing, and disorienting, but beneath it lies a quiet awareness, a sense that something deeper is stirring. Jung described this stage as the night sea journey or the dark night of the soul, a period of transition, where the old self dissolves and the new self is not yet born. It is a time of gestation, of preparing for a new kind of motivation rooted not in ego but in essence. What many struggle with during this stage is the temptation to return to the old ways. When the collapse feels unbearable, the ego whispers, "Go back, chase success again, seek approval, strive for recognition." It offers the comfort of familiar desires, even though they no longer satisfy. If you fall into this trap, you may find yourself achieving the old goals but feeling even emptier than before, because you know too much now to believe in them. The challenge then is to resist the pull of the old and to endure the emptiness, long enough for new motivations to emerge. This endurance requires trust in the process, trust in the self, and trust that the collapse is not the end but the beginning of something greater. Over time, as the dust settles, new desires do begin to arise, but these desires are not driven by fear, competition, or insecurity. They are born from creativity, compassion, and authenticity. You may feel drawn to create art, not for recognition but for the joy of expression. You may feel called to serve others, not for praise but because compassion naturally flows from you. You may pursue work, not because it grants status, but because it aligns with your values and gifts. These motivations feel lighter, freer, and more sustainable than the old ones. They do not drain you with endless striving but nourish you with meaning. This is the transformation Jung envisioned, the shift from living as a servant of the ego to living as an expression of the self. The collapse of ego-driven desires after awakening, then, is not a mistake or a problem to be solved. It is an essential part of the journey toward wholeness. The loss of old motivations is the clearing of space for deeper ones. The emptiness is the fertile ground from which authentic purpose can grow. And while it may feel disorienting and even painful, it is ultimately a liberation, the release from the endless chase of the ego and the beginning of a life rooted in truth. The ego must collapse so that the self can emerge, and with it, a new kind of motivation that is not shaken by the shifting sands of external validation but rooted in the unchanging reality of who you truly are, the spiritual void that follows. Awakening is one of the most confusing yet profoundly necessary stages in inner transformation. Many people anticipate that spiritual awakening will permanently fill them with joy, energy, and clarity, but instead they often encounter a deep emptiness, a loss of drive, and a sense that life has suddenly become still, flat, or meaningless. This is not a sign that something has gone wrong. Rather, it is evidence that something profoundly right is taking place. What collapses in this stage are the illusions and distractions that once fueled the ego, leaving behind a quiet space that can feel unbearable precisely because it is unfamiliar. Carl Jung understood this void as an essential passage in the process of individuation, the journey toward becoming whole. When the ego-driven identity falls apart, the psyche needs time to reorganize itself around a deeper center, and that reorganization begins in silence, not activity. The void arises because awakening strips away the scaffolding that once propped up a person's sense of purpose. Before awakening, much of what people do is fueled by unconscious drives, the need for validation, the desire for success, the pursuit of pleasure, or the avoidance of pain. These drives give a sense of movement, but they are not rooted in truth. They are rooted in fear, insecurity, or longing. When awakening occurs, the false promises of these drives are exposed. The approval of others no longer satisfies, possessions feel empty, and old ambitions lose their allure. Yet, at the same time, the new motivations born from the deeper self have not yet fully emerged. This creates a gap, a liminal space between the old and the new. In this gap, nothing seems to matter, and the familiar engines of action no longer function. That is the spiritual void. This void feels disorienting because the ego interprets it as loss or failure. The ego thrives on activity, goals, and progress, so when those vanish, it panics. It tells you that you are lazy, unmotivated, or broken. But from a deeper perspective, the void is not a failure at all, it is a gestation period. Just as winter is necessary for the renewal of spring, the void is necessary for the birth of authentic purpose. In this stage, the psyche is recalibrating, clearing away old patterns, and creating space for something new to emerge. The absence of drive is not an absence of growth. It is growth happening beneath the surface, in ways you cannot yet see. Often describe the journey of the psyche in symbolic terms, drawing from mythology, alchemy, and religion. The spiritual void corresponds to the alchemical nigredo, the blackening stage where matter is dissolved before being transformed. In psychological terms, it is the dissolution of the old identity, the crumbling of the ego's structures. Just as alchemists believed that this blackening was the necessary first step in creating gold, Jung saw the void as a necessary first step in creating wholeness. To the conscious mind, it feels like death, the death of meaning, direction, and self-image, but to the unconscious, it is the fertile darkness in which transformation can begin. During this stage, many people feel restless, anxious, or even depressed. They wonder why they no longer care about things that once seemed important. Work, relationships, hobbies, or ambitions may feel dull or irrelevant. This loss of interest is not a mistake, it is a sign that the psyche is detaching from false sources of identity. What once fueled you was never truly yours. It was borrowed from cultural expectations, social conditioning, or unresolved fears. The void arises when those external sources lose their grip, leaving you face to face with the raw question, who am I really, when all the roles and illusions fall away? Sitting with that question is the work of this stage, and it cannot be rushed. One of the most difficult aspects of the void is the pressure to fix it. The ego wants to fill the emptiness with new goals, new projects, new distractions. It cannot tolerate stillness, because stillness exposes its fragility. But the spiritual void is not meant to be filled prematurely. If you rush to escape it, you risk falling back into the old patterns of ego-driven striving. The invitation is to stay with the emptiness, to allow the silence to do its work. In that silence, the unconscious is reshaping itself, aligning the psyche with the self rather than the ego. This process requires patience, trust, and the willingness to endure discomfort. The void is also a time of confrontation with the shadow. When external distractions fall away, the hidden parts of the psyche often rise to the surface. Old wounds, repressed emotions, and unresolved conflicts may come into awareness. Without the noise of ambition or achievement to cover them, these shadows demand attention. This is why the void can feel heavy or painful. It is not only the absence of old desires, but the presence of long-buried aspects of the self that now seek integration. Jung believed that true individuation requires facing the shadow, not avoiding it. The void provides the space in which this confrontation becomes possible. Paradoxically, what feels like emptiness is also fullness. The silence of the void contains the seeds of new life, though they are not yet visible. Just as a seed must remain buried in darkness before sprouting, the soul must rest in this void before authentic motivation can emerge. The absence of direction is not a sign that you are lost. It is a sign that the old map no longer applies, and a new one is being drawn from within. This is why Jung and many spiritual traditions emphasize the importance of surrender in this stage. By surrendering to the void rather than fighting it, you allow the deeper self to guide the process. The void also serves as a detox from the overstimulation of the modern world. Much of contemporary life is designed to keep people constantly distracted, constantly chasing, constantly entertained. Awakening disrupts this cycle, pulling you out of the trance. But when the distractions fall away, the initial experience is often boredom or restlessness. These feelings are not signs that something is wrong. They are signs that you are detoxing from the addiction to stimulation. In the stillness of the void, you begin to rediscover simple being, which is richer and more enduring than constant doing. Another important dimension of the void is its relationship to identity. Before awakening, identity is largely constructed by external factors: your job, your achievements, your relationships, your status. When these lose their importance, you may feel like you no longer know who you are. This loss of identity can feel terrifying, but it is also liberating. It strips away the false layers, allowing the authentic self to emerge. The void is the space in which the ego dies and the self is born. Without this death, individuation cannot occur. The discomfort is the labor pain of rebirth. It is important to recognize that the void is not permanent, even though it may feel endless. Its duration varies, but its purpose is the same: to clear away what no longer serves and to prepare the psyche for authentic direction. Those who endure it without clinging to the old or rushing toward the new often emerge with a profound sense of clarity, purpose, and peace. They discover motivations that are not rooted in fear or competition, but in love, creativity, and connection. But these new motivations cannot be forced. They emerge naturally, like sprouts breaking through the soil after winter. The void is the winter, and without it, there can be no spring. Jung often drew parallels between individual transformation and collective myths. In mythology, heroes often descend into the underworld, lose their way, or wander in darkness before returning transformed. The void is your descent into the underworld. It is your wandering in the wilderness. It is not the end of the journey, but a crucial part of it. Without the descent, there can be no ascent. Without the emptiness, there can be no fullness. The myths remind us that the void is not meaningless, it is the crucible of transformation. In the end, the spiritual void is the necessary silence between two worlds, the world of ego-driven striving and the world of authentic living. It is the pause that allows for reorientation, the emptiness that makes space for fullness, the death that precedes rebirth. It is uncomfortable precisely because it is dissolving the old patterns that once gave you a false sense of comfort. But within that discomfort lies the possibility of freedom, the freedom to live no longer as a prisoner of illusions, but as an expression of the deeper self. The lack of motivation is not a flaw but a signal that the old motivations have outlived their purpose. The void is where the psyche rests, recalibrates, and prepares for a new life, aligned not with ego but with truth. When someone undergoes a spiritual awakening, it is easy to assume that clarity and peace will naturally follow, but the reality is often more complex. One of the most challenging aspects of this transformation is that the shadow and unconscious resist the new self, and in doing so, they drain energy and motivation. Carl Jung emphasized that awakening is not the end of inner work, but the beginning of a confrontation with the unconscious. The ego, having been destabilized by the realization that it is not the whole of the self, finds itself caught in a battle with the deeper layers of the psyche. This battle is subtle and internal, but it manifests as fatigue, apathy, confusion, and the very lack of motivation that puzzles so many after awakening. Understanding why this happens requires an exploration of the unconscious and the shadow, and the role they play in shaping both resistance and transformation. The unconscious, in Jung's view, is not merely a reservoir of forgotten memories, but an active, dynamic force that shapes thought, behavior, and perception. Within the unconscious lie archetypes, complexes, and shadow elements, the parts of ourselves we deny, repress, or ignore. When a person awakens spiritually, the conscious mind glimpses the reality of the self, that deeper wholeness which transcends the ego, but the unconscious is not easily integrated into consciousness. Instead, it resists, because it contains material that threatens the stability and control of the ego. The shadow, in particular, represents everything the ego has rejected: anger, fear, jealousy, selfishness, weakness, and other qualities we do not want to admit belong to us. When awakening breaks down the defenses of the ego, these shadow elements begin to surface, and their surfacing is often uncomfortable and destabilizing. This resistance drains motivation because the psyche is suddenly overloaded. The conscious mind wants to move forward with new insights, but the unconscious pulls backward, insisting that old wounds, patterns, and rejected aspects of the self be acknowledged. Imagine trying to run a race while dragging a heavy weight behind you. That is what happens when the unconscious resists. Every step forward feels exhausting, not because you lack ability, but because you are carrying the unintegrated contents of your own psyche. This explains why so many feel tired, unmotivated, or even paralyzed after awakening. It is not laziness. It is the weight of shadow material demanding attention. Jung spoke of this as the confrontation with the shadow, and he insisted it was a necessary step in individuation. Without facing the shadow, no true integration is possible. The problem is that the shadow does not simply sit quietly, waiting to be acknowledged. It actively resists surfacing as intrusive thoughts, emotional volatility, self-sabotage, or feelings of emptiness. For example, someone may feel called to live more authentically after awakening, but their shadow may resist by stirring up fears of rejection or failure. They may begin to procrastinate, lose interest in their goals, or convince themselves that nothing matters. These are not signs of failure, but evidence of the unconscious resisting the changes awakening has initiated. The unconscious also drains motivation by unleashing old complexes. A complex is a cluster of associated thoughts, emotions, and memories, tied to a particular theme such as abandonment, rejection, or inadequacy. Awakening often destabilizes the ego's defenses, allowing these complexes to rise into awareness. When this happens, a person may find themselves suddenly overwhelmed by unresolved pain or tied. Instead of feeling energized by awakening, they feel burdened by old wounds that demand healing. This process requires enormous psychic energy, leaving little left for external pursuits. Thus, what looks like a lack of motivation is actually the redirection of energy inward, toward the confrontation and integration of unconscious material. Another way the unconscious resists is through projection. When shadow elements rise, the ego often deflects them outward, projecting them onto others. Instead of recognizing anger, envy, or fear within, a person may become hypersensitive to these traits in others, feeling constantly bothered, disappointed, or upset. This projection drains energy because it keeps the psyche locked in external battles rather than internal healing. The person feels exhausted not because the world is objectively more difficult, but because their own unconscious material is being fought through the medium of relationships, conflicts, and external struggles. Awakening intensifies this process because it removes the protective illusions the ego once used, forcing the shadow into the light whether or not the person is ready to face it. This inner resistance can feel deeply discouraging. Many people expect awakening to be the beginning of perpetual clarity, but instead they feel more conflicted and unmotivated than before. Jung would say this is not regression but progress. The fact that the shadow is surfacing means the psyche is moving toward wholeness. The lack of motivation is not a permanent state, but a signal that energy is being consumed by inner reorganization. Just as the body requires rest and recovery after a major illness or surgery, the psyche requires rest during the confrontation with the unconscious. What looks like stagnation is actually a hidden process of integration. The process is also cyclical. Awakening may bring a period of clarity and enthusiasm, followed by a plunge into resistance and fatigue. This cycle repeats because the psyche can only handle so much integration at once. Each wave of resistance allows for deeper shadow material to be acknowledged and healed. Over time, the waves become less destabilizing and motivation gradually returns, but it is a different kind of motivation, rooted not in ego-driven ambition but in authenticity and alignment with the self. The shadow does not disappear, but it becomes integrated, losing its power to sabotage from the unconscious. Dreams are one of the ways the unconscious communicates its resistance. Jung paid great attention to dreams, seeing them as messages from the unconscious about what is being resisted or ignored. During the post-awakening void, people often have vivid or unsettling dreams that reveal shadow themes, dreams of conflict, failure, rejection, or hidden fears. These dreams may feel draining, but they are part of the process of bringing unconscious material to light. Paying attention to them, reflecting on their symbols, and integrating their messages can help release the grip of resistance and restore energy. The unconscious also resists because it is afraid of change. Even unhealthy patterns feel safe to the psyche because they are familiar. Awakening threatens this safety by dismantling the old structures. The shadow resists because it associates transformation with annihilation. This fear manifests as apathy, or paralysis, the sense that you cannot move forward, that everything is meaningless, that nothing is worth the effort. Recognizing this resistance for what it is, a defense mechanism of the unconscious, helps prevent identification with it. Instead of believing I am unmotivated, you begin to see, part of me is resisting change because it is afraid. This awareness shifts the relationship with the shadow from conflict to compassion, which is essential for integration. The draining of energy by the unconscious can also be understood in terms of psychic inflation and deflation. Awakening often brings moments of inflation where the ego feels expanded, connected to a larger reality, filled with insight and power. But this inflation is unsustainable, and the unconscious responds by pulling the ego back down into of weakness, doubt, or lack of motivation. This back and forth is not a mistake. It is the psyche's way of finding balance between the ego and the self. The ego must learn humility, and the unconscious ensures this by deflating it when it becomes inflated. The lack of motivation that follows awakening is often a form of deflation, a corrective force that prevents the ego from misusing the insights it has gained. Ultimately, the resistance of the shadow and unconscious is not an enemy but a teacher. It forces you to slow down, to look inward, and to confront the parts of yourself you would rather avoid. It prevents you from bypassing the hard work of integration by demanding your attention. The fatigue, the apathy, the lack of motivation are signals that you are being called inward, into a deeper encounter with yourself. They are invitations to face the shadow, heal old wounds, and integrate the unconscious into consciousness. This work is demanding, and it drains energy because it is profound, but it is also the work that leads to true transformation. In Jung's model of individuation, the goal is not to eliminate the shadow but to integrate it. When the unconscious is acknowledged and brought into relationship with consciousness, it stops resisting. Instead of draining energy, it contributes energy. Motivation returns, but it comes from a deeper place. Instead of being driven by fear, insecurity, or competition, you are motivated by creativity, meaning, and authenticity. The resistance ends when the shadow feels seen and included, and the unconscious is no longer a hidden adversary but a partner. In wholeness, this is why Jung insisted that no true awakening can bypass the shadow. The resistance is the path, and the lack of motivation is not the end of the journey but a sign that the real work has begun. The difference between external ambition and authentic purpose is one of the most critical insights that emerges after spiritual awakening, and it lies at the heart of why motivation changes so dramatically in this stage. Before awakening, most people are driven by what society praises as success, the external markers of achievement such as wealth, status, recognition, or approval. These ambitions are deeply tied to the ego's need to prove itself, to establish an identity that feels secure and valuable in the eyes of others. External ambition is fueled by comparison, competition, and fear of not being enough, fear of being overlooked, fear of insignificance. Authentic purpose, on the other hand, arises from the deeper self, from a place within that is not concerned with appearances or validation but with meaning, truth, and alignment. The transition from ambition to purpose explains why, after awakening, the old motivations collapse and yet a new kind of motivation slowly begins to emerge. External ambition often feels intoxicating. It gives you goals, direction, and a sense of progress. You strive for promotions, accumulate possessions, seek admiration, and compete for recognition, and each achievement brings a temporary rush, but the satisfaction fades quickly, because external ambition is built on a void that cannot be filled from the outside. Jung understood this well. The ego is never satisfied, because it seeks to fill an inner lack with external objects. The more you achieve, the more the ego demands. This endless cycle can carry a person through life without them ever questioning its validity until awakening shatters the illusion. Suddenly you see clearly that no amount of success, money, or praise will make you whole. The realization, that the ladder you were climbing was leaning against the wrong wall can be devastating. The collapse of ambition feels like the collapse of identity, because for so long the ego equated achievement with worth. Authentic purpose, in contrast, does not need external validation. It is not about proving yourself, but about expressing yourself. It emerges when you are aligned with your values, your gifts, and your deeper sense of truth. Purpose is not measured by how much applause you receive or how much wealth you accumulate, but by how fully your actions resonate with the essence of who you are. Jung described this as individuation, the process of becoming whole by integrating all parts of the psyche and aligning with the self. Authentic purpose flows naturally from this alignment. It is not something you chase, but something you embody. It often feels less like striving and more like allowing the energy of life to move through you in ways that serve both yourself and others. The tension between ambition and purpose becomes most evident in the experience of motivation. Ambition creates motivation through pressure. You feel you must achieve, must succeed, must prove yourself. It is a whip that drives you forward, often at the cost of peace, health, or authenticity. Purpose creates motivation through inspiration. You feel drawn to act, not because you must, but because you are moved by love, curiosity, or a sense of calling. Purposeful motivation feels lighter, freer, and more sustainable than ambition. It does not burn you out because it arises from the deeper self rather than the insecure ego. After awakening, when ambition collapses, there is often a period of emptiness before purpose emerges, and this gap can feel confusing. You may wonder why you no longer care about the things that once motivated you, but it is because those things belonged to ambition, not purpose. One way to distinguish between ambition and purpose is to examine how you respond to failure. In ambition, failure is devastating because it threatens the ego's sense of worth. If your promotion is denied, if your business falters, if your achievements go unnoticed, the ego feels annihilated. In purpose, failure is simply part of the process because purpose is rooted in authenticity rather than validation. Setbacks do not threaten your identity. They are opportunities to learn, adapt, or deepen your alignment. This resilience makes purpose more enduring than ambition. Ambition is fragile, dependent on outcomes, while purpose is steady, grounded in being rather than doing. Another distinction lies in how ambition and purpose relate to others. Ambition often positions others as competitors or obstacles. Their success threatens you because it diminishes your chance of being recognized. Their criticism enrages you because it challenges your fragile identity. Purpose, however, sees others differently. When you live from purpose, others' successes inspire you because you see them as living authentically in their own way. Others' criticism does not shatter you because you are no longer living to please them. Purpose connects rather than divides because it is rooted in the wholeness of the self, which recognizes the wholeness in others. The shift from ambition to purpose also transforms how you experience time. Ambition is future-oriented. It is always chasing the next goal, always sacrificing the present for some imagined reward. This creates anxiety, restlessness, and a sense that life is never enough. Purpose, on the other hand, is rooted in the present. It arises naturally from being fully here, fully alive in this moment. When you act from purpose, the action itself is fulfilling, regardless of outcome. A writer writing from ambition is obsessed with sales, reviews, and recognition. A writer writing from purpose is absorbed in the act of creation, because the process itself is the reward. This presence infuses life with peace, because you are no longer postponing fulfillment to some future achievement. Jung believed that the journey of individuation requires moving from ego-centered living to self-centered living. In the sense of aligning with the deeper self, ambition belongs to the ego, purpose belongs to the self. This does not mean ambition is useless. In early stages of life, ambition helps build identity, discipline, and skill. It serves as scaffolding. But once awakening occurs, the scaffolding must fall away so that the true structure of the self can be revealed. Clinging to ambition after awakening is like clinging to training wheels. When you are ready to ride freely, it only slows the process. The collapse of ambition is painful, but it is necessary, because it clears space for purpose to emerge. One of the challenges of this transition is that society rarely supports purpose. External ambition is rewarded with money, praise, and status. Purpose, especially in its early stages, may not bring external rewards. It may even be misunderstood or dismissed. For someone who has awakened, this can be disheartening, because They no longer care about ambition but also struggle to see how purpose fits into the external world. This tension requires courage, the courage to live authentically even when it defies external expectations. Over time, purpose often aligns with external opportunities. But the key is to remain rooted in authenticity rather than bending to societal definitions of success. The energy of ambition is competitive. The energy of purpose is creative. Ambition seeks to conquer, to dominate, to accumulate. Purpose seeks to express, to contribute, to connect. When you act from ambition, your energy often feels tense, contracted, and focused narrowly on outcomes. When you act from purpose, your energy feels expansive, open, and aligned with a larger flow. This difference in energy explains why ambition often leads to burnout while purpose sustains you. The exhaustion many feel after awakening is partly the exhaustion of ambition finally wearing itself out, leaving behind a blank canvas upon which purpose can be painted. Purpose also has a spiritual dimension that ambition lacks. Ambition is tied to the ego's need for security and control. Purpose arises from a sense of connection to something larger than the self, whether you call it the self, God, the universe, or life itself. Acting from purpose feels like participating in a greater unfolding, rather than striving alone. It carries a sense of grace, as if your actions are guided and supported by forces beyond your conscious will. This spiritual quality infuses life with meaning that ambition can never provide. Ambition asks, how can I prove myself? Purpose asks, how can I serve what is true within me and around me? This difference is not abstract. It is lived in the small choices of everyday life. When faced with a decision, ambition asks, what will make me look successful? Purpose asks, what feels authentic and meaningful? When interacting with others, ambition asks, how can I impress them? Purpose asks, how can I connect with them genuinely? These subtle shifts transform relationships, work, creativity, and self-expression. They dissolve the constant irritation and anger that arise when the ego feels threatened. Because purpose does not need to defend itself. It is secure in its own authenticity. The transition from ambition to purpose does not happen overnight. It often begins with collapse. The old ambitions lose their grip, leaving a period of emptiness. This void can feel frightening, because without ambition you may feel you have no direction. But this emptiness is the soil in which purpose grows. Slowly you begin to notice what truly lights you up, what resonates deeply, what feels aligned with your essence. These small sparks are the beginnings of authentic purpose. Over time, as you trust and follow them, they grow into a steady flame. Motivation returns, but it is no longer frantic or desperate. It is calm, clear, and enduring. Jung described individuation as the process of becoming who you truly are. The difference between ambition and purpose is a reflection of this process. Ambition is who you thought you had to be. Purpose is who you really are. Ambition is driven by fear of inadequacy. Purpose is driven by the joy of authenticity. Ambition ends in emptiness. Purpose ends in fulfillment. The lack of motivation after awakening is the natural collapse of ambition. The quiet emergence of new, authentic motivations is the beginning of purpose. When you make this shift, life no longer feels like a constant battle to prove yourself. It feels like an unfolding journey of expressing who you truly are, guided not by the demands of the world but by the truth of your soul. Rebuilding motivation through alignment with deeper meaning is the final and most transformative stage in the journey that follows spiritual awakening, when the old ego-driven ambitions collapse and the void of emptiness has been endured. When the shadow has been confronted and the unconscious begins to integrate, a new kind of motivation slowly emerges. This motivation is not built upon fear, competition, or the restless striving of the ego, but upon authenticity, wholeness, and the pull of the deeper self. It is a motivation that arises not from external pressure but from internal resonance, not from the need to prove oneself but from the joy of being oneself. Carl Jung spoke of individuation as the process by which a person becomes whole, and in this wholeness lies the key to renewed motivation. To rebuild motivation after awakening is to allow life to be guided not by superficial ambitions but by deeper meaning, the kind of meaning that cannot be shaken by external circumstances. At the heart of this new motivation is the discovery that meaning is more powerful than desire. Desire is fleeting. It chases temporary rewards and fades once those rewards are attained. Meaning, however, endures, because it connects your actions to something larger than yourself. Viktor Frankl, who drew inspiration from Jung and other depth psychologists, observed that those who have a strong sense of meaning can endure almost any circumstance. In the same way, after awakening, when ego desires lose their force, what replaces them is not apathy but a search for meaning. And once meaning is discovered, motivation follows naturally, because meaning provides a wellspring of energy that external rewards can never supply. Rebuilding motivation through meaning requires a shift in perspective. Instead of asking, what will make me successful? The question becomes, what feels aligned with who I truly am? Instead of, how can I be admired? The question becomes, how can I live in a way that expresses my authentic self? This shift transforms how goals are set, how energy is used, and how life is lived. For example, someone who once pursued wealth as a measure of worth may find themselves drawn to work that reflects their values, even if it pays less. Another who once sought recognition in their field may instead focus on creating work that feels deeply true, even if it remains unnoticed. The motivation to act in these cases is not diminished. It is strengthened, because it comes from the inside rather than the outside. The process of rebuilding motivation also involves listening deeply to the inner voice of the self. After awakening, the noise of the ego begins to quiet, making space for subtler signals to be heard: intuition, inspiration, synchronicities, and dreams. These signals often point toward areas of life where meaning can be found. Jung believed that the psyche is self-regulating, always moving toward balance and wholeness, and that the unconscious communicates through symbols to guide the individual. Paying attention to these inner signals allows motivation to arise organically, as the self directs energy toward the activities, relationships, and pursuits that foster growth and authenticity. Authentic motivation also arises from service and connection. While ambition is self-centered, purpose often expresses itself in ways that benefit others. When you live authentically, you naturally contribute to the world, because authenticity resonates with the interconnectedness of life. This does not mean everyone must engage in grand acts of service, but that authentic motivation often takes the form of creating, helping, teaching, or expressing in ways that uplift others. For some, this might mean building a community. For others, it might mean creating art, caring for family, or engaging in work that aligns with collective well-being. Motivation rooted in meaning is sustainable because it is not drained by constant self-comparison. It flows outward in a way that feels natural and fulfilling. Another key aspect of rebuilding motivation is embracing creativity. Creativity is one of the purest expressions of the self, because it involves bringing something new into existence. When ambition collapses, creativity often awakens, not as a tool for recognition but as a joy in itself. Writing, painting, designing, inventing, or even creating new ways of living become channels for expressing deeper meaning. Jung himself explored his unconscious through art, drawing, and building, finding that creativity connected him to the archetypal forces within. When you create for the sake of expression rather than applause, motivation is rekindled, because creativity flows from the infinite well of the psyche rather than the finite demands of the ego. Meaning-based motivation also transforms the relationship with challenges. In ambition, obstacles are frustrating because they block progress toward an external goal. In purpose, challenges are embraced as opportunities for growth and deepening alignment. When your actions are motivated by meaning, even difficulties feel worthwhile, because they serve the larger process of becoming whole. This resilience is one of the hallmarks of authentic motivation. You continue not because it is easy or because others approve, but because it resonates with your truth. Obstacles no longer deter you, they refine you. Rebuilding motivation through meaning also requires patience, because this kind of motivation grows slowly. Unlike ambition, which often erupts in bursts of energy fueled by fear or competition, meaning-based motivation develops quietly, like roots spreading beneath the soil. At first, you may feel uncertain, moving tentatively toward what feels authentic, but as you trust the process, clarity deepens, and the energy to act increases. Over time, motivation becomes steady and consistent, not because you are forcing yourself, but because you are aligned. The energy of alignment is vastly different from the energy of striving. It does not exhaust, it sustains. Authentic motivation also shifts how success is defined. In ambition, success is measured by outcomes, money earned, recognition gained, goals accomplished. In purpose, success is measured by alignment. Am I living true to myself? Am I expressing what feels meaningful? Am I growing into wholeness? This redefinition of success dissolves much of the irritation and anger that once arose from comparison or failure. When success is no longer dependent on others' approval, you become free. Motivation no longer waxes and wanes with external circumstances. It flows steadily from the internal wellspring of meaning. Living from authentic purpose does not mean abandoning all ambition, but rather transforming it. The same discipline, focus, and drive that once served the ego can now serve the self. Goals still exist, but they are aligned with meaning rather than fear. For example, you may still work to build a career, but not as a way to prove worth, instead, as a way to express your gifts. You may still seek to create something of value, but not for applause, instead, for the joy of creating. This transformation allows ambition to be integrated into a larger framework of purpose, where it becomes a tool rather than a master. Meaning-based motivation also connects to a sense of the sacred. Many who undergo awakening report that even ordinary activities take on a new depth when aligned with authenticity. Walking in nature, cooking a meal, or engaging in conversation can feel purposeful when experienced as expressions of the self. Motivation no longer depends on dramatic achievements, but flows from the recognition that every moment holds potential for meaning. This recognition brings peace, because you no longer feel pressured to constantly accomplish in order to justify your existence. Instead, you live from the understanding that existence itself is meaningful, and that motivation is simply the natural flow of participating in life's unfolding. Jung emphasized that individuation is not about becoming perfect but about becoming whole. Rebuilding motivation through meaning is part of this wholeness. It means integrating the lessons of collapse, void, and shadow, and emerging with a new orientation to life. This orientation is not about what you can acquire, but about what you can embody. It is about living in such a way that your actions reflect the truth of your being. When you live this way, motivation is no longer something you must summon with effort. It arises spontaneously, because it is aligned with the deepest currents of your soul. The motivation that emerges after awakening is often quieter but stronger than before. It does not shout, but it endures. It does not whip you forward with fear, but it pulls you gently with resonance. It does not burn out, because it is sustained by the inexhaustible energy of meaning. And while it may not look like ambition to the outside world, it carries a depth and authenticity that ambition can never match. Others may not always understand it, but you will feel it as a steady flame within, guiding your choices, fueling your creativity, and sustaining your journey.